causes flooding?
It's when rivers overflow.
What causes flooding?
When there's too much water for the ground to absorb.
What do you mean by absorb?
The water goes into the ground.
How does water going into the ground affect flooding?
What do you mean by that?
Well, if the ground can't absorb the water, how can that cause flooding?
Oh, so if water can't go into the ground, then obviously the water will build up and that's flooding?
So the ability for soil to absorb water affects flooding. Go.
These green sponges represent forested area. When heavy rain falls with all the trees, bushes, and natural grasses growing, it absorbs a lot more than when it falls in an inhabited area where there's streets and short-cropped lawns. Here's one water bottle. We're going to pour this into the forested area to see how much it absorbs. This represents heavy rainfall, which is a common cause of flooding. See how there's no leaking? The whole water bottle is almost poured in, and these sponges, or the natural area, is just absorbing all the water, so there's no flooding. Now let's try this same situation again. Same amount of water will now be poured into the inhabited area, where our roads, short-cropped grass, and houses are. I have barely even poured anything, and there's already severe amounts of flooding because there is no natural area here to absorb all of the heavy rainfall.
By keeping natural land open, there will be more areas where water can be absorbed by. This will keep flood water from coming into our cities and our towns. How can humans predict flooding?
Well, when it rains a lot, it floods, and we can tell that that's going to happen by watching the weather on the news.
How do you think that helps humans predict flooding?
Humans can tell the weather for the week, so we know what the temperature is. I guess that could probably predict that there will be a rain or a lot of rain.
How can humans predict flooding?
They can look at the weather and see what it does repeatedly.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, when something happens a lot, it makes a pattern.
What kind of patterns do you see in the weather?
Well, it rains a lot in the spring, and it snows a lot in the winter.
What makes that a pattern?
Because it rains more every year in the spring and snows every winter.
Interesting. If humans can look at weather patterns to predict weather or flooding, how can humans prepare for flooding?
If they can predict the weather, I guess they could tell when it's going to rain a lot. If you look at the pattern, it helps you understand better when that might happen. Then we can make sure not to be in those areas that could flood.
So this green area again represents our natural area. This open spot is our river. We're going to show you how when melting snow fills a river, we can predict how much water will be going into the river and how much of that water might overflow those banks. We know that by how much snow is around. So at a natural state, before the flood or before the runoff from snow, the river is about at this point, right where that water is. This is how high it is. So these ice cubes represent the snowfall in a year. This year looks like we have a lot of snowfall. So we're going to predict a lot of water coming from the melting snow. If all of this snow were to be replaced by the water it will create, the banks should overflow. From our predictions, we can tell that this might cause some flooding because it might go above the banks. We're not very far from the banks right now with where the water is. So, this hairdryer represents the warm weather, another weather pattern that we can predict. The warm weather is melting the snow, causing the water in the river to rise and possibly flood the banks. This was our first measure of the water before snow melts. Let's measure again after snow melt. Look how much higher the water has gotten. It has overrun the banks. and this will cause flooding.
One of the main ways we can predict flooding is measuring how much snowfall occurs. Then we can predict warm weather and how much of that snow will melt into the rivers from the warm weather, and measure the level of that river after the warm weather occurs. There are ways for humans to prevent flooding. Humans can put up dams and levees to stop water from flowing into towns and inhabited areas when it floods. Humans have even constructed automatically closing doors to prevent extra water from going beyond certain areas. While humans can do all of these things, we can still use nature as one of our main defenses by leaving natural areas natural. When flooding does occur in towns and inhabited areas, people can take precautions by making safety kits and making safety plans, digging trenches around their houses, or even putting up sandbags as blockades.